welcome. My name is Hannah Kemp-Welch. I am the Vice Chair of London CND, and a warm welcome to everyone who's joining us for this event today. We're going to be with you for an hour. There's going to be opportunities to interact and to ask questions. But just to give you an overview of this event, it was organised by the London Region Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament in collaboration with the East Midlands Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament and Youth and Student CND as well. We feel it's really important and very timely to be considering issues around nuclear disarmament and to make sure that we're equipped with some rebuttals and arguments with people, particularly maybe during the festive season where we go home and see our families who may not share our political views. So in order to be equipped for uncomfortable conversations with relatives around the Christmas nut roast, then this will hopefully be a fun way for us to share some of these thoughts. The UK is spending £205 billion on Trident renewal, and the government has also just announced an extra £16.5 billion which they propose to spend on defence, or what they call defence, which is an extra 4.5 billion more than they're putting towards combating climate change. Yet we feel hopeful at the moment because on the 22nd of January, we are awaiting the ratification of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which will become international law after 50 countries have ratified the agreement, with a further 84 countries signing it. So this is really exciting news because the world has said, we hate nuclear weapons and we want to get rid of them, and they're taking decisive steps to make it internationally illegal to assist in any way in the production or transportation or involvement in any way down to producing screws, which will then end up as part of nuclear missiles. So this is why we feel this event is really timely. And on the subject of the event title, just wanted to maybe spend a minute introducing the connection between gender, race, and nuclear weapons. This is personal for me because I travelled to Japan for the commemoration of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki last year. And there were lots of young women who were at the World Conference speaking about the abolition of nuclear weapons and talking about how women around the world are disproportionately affected by war. And they talked about as well how endless military spending, of course, means cuts to social spending, which again disproportionately affects women globally. They talked about military service and how patriarchy and militarism seem to go hand in hand, and as well about the language that is used around nuclear weapons, which seems to be, again, highly patriarchal. So we've invited some fantastic speakers from around the world to join us today to discuss some of these issues. And I would like to just let you know that there will be opportunities to pose your questions in using the chat function of this Zoom meeting, and that nobody will be obliged during our later game to speak. So please don't feel that at any stage we will put you on the spot. Please do feel free to relax and participate from the safety of your keyboard. I'm really excited to introduce the first speaker. The first speaker is from an organisation called Reaching Critical, World War II. And Ray is the director of the Disarmament Programme at the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and also a steering group member of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. She has a book which is coming out next year about the process to achieve the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which is called Banning the Bomb, Smashing the Patriarchy. She was announced as American. We apologise for that, but we're taking this chance to rectify that she is Canadian and Irish, but lives in New York, and it's from there that Ray is joining us tonight. Ray, I'll hand over to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Hannah, and for everybody else involved in organizing this event. And thank you very much to Karina for getting up very, very early in the morning to do this. It's so great to be on a panel with you again. It's been a while, given COVID. So yeah, I thought I'd give just a few quick remarks about a feminist analysis of nuclear weapons, and then I'm happy later on throughout the course of the event to take questions if anything's not clear or if there's anything I don't touch upon that you're wondering about. First of all, when we talk about nuclear weapons from a gender perspective, there is actually gendered harms from nuclear bombs, which I think a lot of people don't realize. It seems like these weapons are indiscriminate in terms of the harm that they cause, but scientific studies have shown us that ionizing radiation from nuclear weapons actually impacts women and girls' bodies differently, and can have long-lasting impacts on health in different ways. And so being aware of that is really important, I think, and gives kind of a new angle to this issue for some people. But I also think that for me, that's not kind of the most interesting or really urgent issue when it comes to a feminist perspective on nuclear weapons, because coming at this as a feminist means really interrogating what these weapons do, not just to human bodies, but also to our culture and to the way that we all exist in this world together. And so there's, in addition to the gendered harms, there's also gendered discourse or gendered language around nuclear weapons that is really important to pay attention to. Some of you might be familiar with the work of Carol Cohn, who is a feminist theorist who did sort of a deep dive ethnographic experience with nuclear war planners back in the 1980s and brought to the world's attention how sexualized and graphic the imagery and the discussion around nuclear weapons was back in those days. And while the conference rooms in the United Nations don't necessarily engage in exactly that kind of rhetoric today, the implications are still with us, and the sort of the rationales and the philosophies behind that kind of discourse still persist today. There's a lot of abstraction about nuclear weapons. They're talked about as deterrents, and the UK government in particular uses deterrent as a noun. They don't even say our nuclear weapons or our nuclear arsenals. The UK government says our nuclear deterrent. And so it makes deterrent into an object when in fact it is a theory, and many of us would argue a myth, and a misconception and a constructed idea about nuclear weapons. And so one of the most important feminist contributions to this field really is making sure that we talk about these weapons for what they are and naming them for what they are, which is weapons of mass destruction, weapons of genocide, weapons of terror. And this means that we need to be listening to those that have a lived reality of nuclear weapons. So listening to the survivors from Japan, listening to survivors from the areas where nuclear weapons have been tested, and Karina is going to speak more to that, of course. Listening to impacted communities where there's been uranium mining and nuclear waste storage and the production of nuclear weapons. So listening to people that actually have these lived experiences rather than those who are sitting in offices constructing theories in order to justify massive investments in these weapons of mass destruction. Another important thing that feminism really brings to the conversation about nuclear weapons is conceiving of them within the broader patriarchal militarist structures that we live, and looking at these as weapons of dominance and control, as tools of patriarchy. They are used every day in order to exercise power through threats and violence. And so it's really an interrogation and confrontation of this idea that nuclear weapons haven't been used since they were used in Japan, but are in fact part of international relations, and they are used in order to control and dominate. And then also another thing that I think feminist analysis really brings to this is looking at the patriarchal techniques that are used to suppress or to quell debate around nuclear weapons and around nuclear abolition. So techniques like gaslighting and victim blaming, which some of you might have heard in other contexts as being tools of patriarchy, to sort of put down those who would argue that nuclear abolition is realistic or desirable. And the proponents of nuclear weapons use all kinds of patriarchal techniques against those of us who support nuclear disarmament. So accusing abolitionists of being emotional or of being irrational. And this isn't just towards activists, this is towards other diplomats, for example, in the UN scene that promote nuclear disarmament or that want to talk about the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. They are called by government representatives from other countries emotional. They're accused of that. And so I think paying attention to that and sort of dissecting that and being aware of it is a really important thing that feminist policy, feminist thinking can bring to this field. And then in terms of broader understandings of security, feminism has a lot to offer here. There's been so much scholarly and activist work trying to redefine security from a feminist perspective to draw us away from the kind of traditional militarized conceptions where violence is about strength and power and where might equals right and those kinds of things where we need a lot of weapons in order to be safe and secure in the world, and instead turning to feminist conceptions of security which are based on human well-being for as many human beings as possible, not just those in a position of power. And that can be achieved through dialogue and cooperation and through disarmament and through investments in things that prevent harm rather than cause harm. So some of you may work on other issues. Here in the US where I'm living, there's been a real resurgence of the debate around abolishing police. There's been a lot of work, I know from many of you over many years, to abolish militaries. And these are all consistent with the project of abolishing nuclear weapons as well. And in each of these avenues of work, we're looking to put money not into weapons, not into nuclear arsenals, not into militaries and war or policing, but investing in the things that prevent these types of structures from seeming necessary in the first place. So I think I'll leave it there, but happy to discuss further in the Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ray. If anyone has any questions for Ray, then do put them in the chat. Ray, would you like me to select questions and read them out, or are you happy to have a look through the chat and pick those that you'd like to respond to?
I'm just having a look now. Catherine has posted Carol Cohn's work. Thanks for that, Catherine. That's useful. I don't see any questions in the chat, unless I'm missing something.
In that case, could I ask one just to get us started?
Sure.
So when I was in Japan, then I went to visit hibakusha in hospitals, and I heard a lot about the stigma faced by women survivors. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about kind of gender-based stigma surrounding nuclear weapons. I know as well that I've done lots of interviews with women who were at Greenham, and they also talked about gender-based stigma, about being called witches and all kinds of things like that, and hugely demonized in the media and told that they would never be able to be married because they were sort of witches in the woods and things like that. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about gender-based stereotyping around anti-nuclear activism.
Yeah, absolutely. So the stigma faced by survivors from Japan, yeah, that was based on these fears around reproductive health and maternal mortality and that kind of thing, and feeling that the women and young girls that survived Hiroshima and Nagasaki would not be, marriage material, etc. And hibakusha can speak more to that issue, of course, but it was a real harm that was faced for many women who survived that experience and lived in the aftermath of that situation. And the stigma then around women who are calling for nuclear abolition, the Greenham women, and really anybody, I mean, a lot of that has to do with our patriarchal structure as well, too, right? It's about women having opinions. It's about women being political actors as opposed to just passive in the background. And so there is absolutely a lot of this stigmatization and suppression of dissent going on at play here that's really patriarchal. And I think that that's one of the things that I mentioned about witnessing diplomats being called emotional for I think a lot of people that were involved in the process of developing the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons over many years. That was really an insight or a wake-up call or you know, an interesting experience for them to see that the feminist critique had so much relevance for them as well. And I don't just mean for that this was levied against women diplomats, this was also against men. And I think that, you know, just it was kind of a lived experience for them of, oh goodness, you're not wrong about this. This has grounding, and this is patriarchal, and this is, I think, something that a lot of people realized they needed to carry into their world at large as a reality that we face in terms of being critical of any dominant structure of power or a narrative that has held on to the public's imagination for so long as, say, nuclear deterrence has.
Thank you. We have a question, or perhaps a comment from Floyd here. Floyd, would you like to unmute yourself and read your comment or say it?
Thank you. Basically, just trying to find it now. An argument has been made for those who were pro-Trump during the last election, and indeed when he was first standing in 2016, that he was the only person who could negotiate with North Korea due to his appeal in inverted commas as a strongman. And I noticed that this is a common refrain in mainstream politics, that strength deters violence, aggression, etc. I was wondering if Ray could comment on that, because it also links back to what she was saying earlier with regards to the euphemism of deterrence, you know, as a way of getting around saying nuclear weapons, because I think obviously people realise that when you say nuclear weapons, that's not a neutral term. You know, by its definition, that is an overt militarist, aggressive naming, you know, of things. Whereas saying deterrence sounds more neutral, sounds more cuddly, not so threatening.
Yeah, so definitely that has been a problematic perception of the Trump presidency from its beginning, and also why he still retained over 70 million votes in this country in the most recent election. And so, you know, that is one of the fundamental problems is the perception that violence equals strength. And this plays out at the UN itself, where in particular over the last 4 years, the positioning has gotten increasingly aggressive and confrontational, particularly between the United States and Russia, and a few others as well, and this sort of standoff, personality-based bravado that we see on display. The thing is that in reality, it doesn't work to achieve anything. It can put on a good show for those, I suppose, who want to support that. But the people that are getting the work done are the ones that are willing to talk to each other across borders and across positions, and really do dialogue and really do cooperation. And we saw that very clearly with this complete stalemate that we've had for decades now in the disarmament forums at the United Nations. We haven't been able to negotiate a nuclear related treaty since the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty in 1996. That is a very long time ago. And yet, you know, and that's because the sort of confrontation amongst the nuclear armed states has not allowed for any progress or flexibility. Whereas when the rest of the world got together to negotiate a treaty, they were able to do so with relative ease. Once they made the decision to go ahead and do these negotiations, it only took a few months in order to do it. And the end product is of extraordinarily high quality. So I think it really shows what can happen and what the difference is when people do work together, even if they don't all agree with each other on everything, versus the sort of bravado, macho, confrontational approach to politics and international relations.
Thanks, Ray. We have a question from Em, and if you are able to unmute.
Hello, hi, I'm Emma. Ray, I just want to thank you as always for your contributions. They're always great every time I manage to catch you speaking. Sorry, I'm just doing some childcare at the moment. It was just a quick question. You'd mentioned I've read online about the ongoing campaigns against uranium mining across the US, and from what I can see, these campaigns seem to be run by women front and center, which I thought was really interesting. And obviously, there's the intersection with the people that are most effective are like Native Americans. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that, just 'cause it's something I'm really interested in.
Yeah, definitely. Most of the work done against uranium mining in the US and also in Canada is organized by indigenous communities, because that is the land where most of the uranium is coming from. So one of the big efforts, for example, is in the Navajo or Dene region of the United States in the Southwest. And also incidentally nearby in the Western Shoshone region is where most of the nuclear testing took place as well in the United States. And so, yeah, those campaigns are very active and connected. They're not as visible, which is interesting in recent years, I would say, as they were in the past. You kind of have to know that this work is going on. In the 1960s and the 1980s, I think they were much more prominent. But the determined work is still very active and inspiring. And I think I don't know how much connection there has been between the movements against uranium mining in the US and Canada and Australia. Maybe Karina can speak to that later. I don't know if there's been much collaborative work. There was a bit of joint work around the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, but I don't know about in terms of uranium mining.
Many thanks, Ray. I see that we have potentially some more questions, but if it's okay, I'm going to move on to the next speaker, and hopefully we'll have time at the end to come back to these questions. If not, we'll try and do a follow-up, make sure that some of these are answered. But I'm really super happy to be able to introduce our next speaker, Karina Lester, who is from the Western Desert region of Australia and is a devoted anti-nuclear campaigner. Karina will be sharing not only her late father, Yami Lester's story, but also her grandmother's story of the British nuclear tests in the 1950s and 60s. And Karina speaks strongly about the impacts felt by her people from these tests. Recent works have been with the Nobel Peace Prize Award recipients ICAN, that's the International Campaign for Abolishing Nuclear Weapons, and the UN treaty negotiations, so the prohibition of nuclear weapons, SA Royal Commissions into International Waste Storage Facility, and also with the National Waste Storage Facility, We Say No campaign. Karina is joining us, and it's about, I think, 6:30 in the morning, is it, where you are, Karina? So thank you so much for waking up at probably 5 a.m. to speak to us. We're honoured to have you here.
No, thank you, Hannah, and thank you to all you organisers in pulling this event together. It's about 6 o'clock here in South Australia. So good morning from Australia, and it's great to be a part of this panel, and also, you know, having the opportunity to chat with or be part of it with Ray as well, because her and I met during this whole journey as well, with the leading up to the treaty, and it's been a whole learning experience for myself. I'm a second generation survivor from what's known as the Western Desert region, or from the language groups of Bianca and Yankunytjatjara. I'm the youngest daughter of late Yami Lester, who was very instrumental in calling the Royal Commission when the British nuclear test took place in our traditional lands in South Australia, in what would have been seen as outback, remote and isolated. Was very much a part of our traditional lands, and that did come out in the Royal Commission, that those lands were used by Untitled, which is the term we use for Aboriginal people from that Western Desert region. And so they are, you know, very important to us, these lands. My late father and his people was exposed through the Emu Fields test that took place in October 1953. On the 15th of October was the first mainland test, and a couple of days later, on the 27th of October, the second Totem 2 was the second test. It was a very remote location, but those two tests had radiation fallout over our main community at a place called Walyajara or Wallatina, where many people were still living a very traditional life. And you still see evidence today, because through Dad's journey, he was able to secure parts of those traditional lands, which is the lands that we often go back to. Being based in Adelaide, I often travel up that way. And so it was also in the Royal Commission identified that was such a large area that one patrol officer had to cover to get out there and inform Untitled. One patrol officer who didn't speak Bianca or Yankunytjatjara language, only spoke to many of the non-Aboriginal pastoralists and missionaries that he had travelled to. And I know through our oral history that many remember this man, Mr. McDougall, who had such a huge responsibility of informing Aboriginal people that they were going to be tested on back in 1953. So that was certainly a huge task for one man to cover that large area. And so many of our people have been, I guess, put in the situation of one, not being informed of and getting or having the opportunity to give prior consent, and to, you know, be well informed about what was about to happen. And there was a lot of course, communication barrier being, you know, one of the big key issues as well, plus the vastness or the remoteness of the state in South Australia where they tested for the first Emu Fields test. Due to that location, it later moved down to Maralinga in further south, which was closer to the railway line. And so many of the people down there were also relocated as well to various areas, such as Sejuna community in the West Coast and around to Kubapidi, Gerard community also, one of the missions also travelling up to Kubapidi. So they relocated Aboriginal people and moved them into different communities, different regions, and out of their traditional lands. And so displaced them from their traditional lands. And that was a huge issue, and many of them feel that today as well. Soon after that test on Totem 1, many of the people in Dad's community started to feel the impact. So the tests were in the morning, and by that evening, many became really ill. And so many suffered from skin rashes to diarrhea and vomiting, and many suffered from the older generation. And we hear throughout our normal oral history that our older generation really suffered and died from the exposure of that fallout from Totem 1. And, you know, many today suffer from those ongoing illnesses as well, respiratory issues to autoimmune diseases to skin issues and so forth. So one of the concerns from, you know, our Ngunnawal community is the lack of ongoing support. And that's what's been identified, and it's Article 6 of that Ban Nuclear Weapons Treaty, or the Treaty to Prohibit Nuclear Weapons. Article 6 outlines the need for assistance for nuclear victims or survivors, and then also to look at the environmental remediation as well, which is a huge part, and a lot of the story coming from that Pacific region as well. So many, you know, people within, or First Nations or indigenous peoples of the Pacific region were very strong about making sure something was put in there. And you only have to hear the stories of, you know, Marshall Islands and Australia and into, you know, Tahiti and the atolls and the testing they did, you know, the ongoing damage that's felt by the environment and by, you know, people of those regions as well. So that was a huge part of my involvement leading up to, as civil society, to go in there and to really speak for the Pacific area and to talk about the impacts that we are feeling from this. And this is generational, and my personal family struggles have been for the last 4 generations now. And this was quite huge when we did get the 50th ratification, that, you know, we were starting to head into a right positive direction, but still a lot of work, because Australia and other countries around the world haven't signed on the treaty. And so that is an issue for many of us back home here in Australia, is how do we continue to lobby and build the awareness within our communities. And that's not only within our own Aboriginal communities and speaking in a language that our people understand, like Bianca and Yankunytjatjara language, but also reaching out to the broader community as well. It's been a huge challenge. And, you know, as I mentioned, that leading up to that, there was to the treaty, there was a lot of work, of course, where I, along with my older sister as well, travelled around to various locations and in bringing that awareness to the wider community, and, you know, doing some speaker tours across our nation, but then also being able to be involved in some of the discussions there at the United Nations, which was an amazing experience, coming from, you know, South Australia, but then also carrying Dad's story, my late father's story, of what happened to his people in such a remote and isolated location. And, you know, a lot of it's often seen that because it's out of sight, out of mind, that there is no real existence of Aboriginal people. It's part of the nuclear racism that we have felt, that we kind of, you know, maybe there, maybe not there, seen, maybe not. So then let's test and let's, you know, let's use this area of land. There are those ongoing issues today as well. I think in South Australia, we have a number of uranium mines in our state, and that's a huge issue. Also, you know, various in the Northern Territory as well, there's some uranium mines up there. And so, and again, those mines are on those traditional lands as well. One of the other issues that we are faced with also here in South Australia is the waste dump issue. And that's been an ongoing thing. That's been something we've been fighting for the last 10 years. It comes and then it goes, and now it's come back to South Australia. And that is one of the huge issues that we have now, or one of the fights that we have on our hands, is blocking our national nuclear waste dump here in South Australia. So it came back in about 1998. And that was part of the Irari Wandi campaign. And I just wanted to share to the many participants. There's an image of my grandmother's Gorbabiri Gungajuda, just so people can have an understanding of this generational struggle and the fight that we've been going through. So I'm going to hopefully get this to you guys. So this image, I'll start off with the image of my amazing grandmothers who formed the Gorbabiri Gungajuda against the Howard government. And they were very strong. And of those amazing old women that you see on the screen, only one is with us today. And so we have lost many of our elders over the years. And an image of my late father, who was very instrumental in the Royal Commission into the British nuclear tests, and just really getting out this story from Aboriginal people of what happened to his community in South Australia at Yankunytjatjara, and their involvement into the Royal Commission. And as I mentioned, they had travelled from Australia over to the UK to give their evidence, as well as Aboriginal people and Anangu from that area where it was tested on. So many, took those stories from these remote locations and, travelled far and wide to get the message out to the wider community about what happened to Aboriginal people in South Australia. And it was important for us to join those relationships, I guess, with our southern Maralingga mob as well, which were the people who were exposed to the ongoing testing then in Maralingga lands as well. And so it was really important for us as Aboriginal people in Anangu to be, I guess, seen to be standing in solidarity together as well of what happened, Emu Fields tests and Totem 1 and Totem 2, and then the ongoing tests at Maralingga with buffalo. And that story was so important. And, it was a huge part of Dad's and Anol's lives achievement, I guess, in really talking out and exposing what the British government and the Australian government had done to Aboriginal people in South Australia. I think I'll leave it there, but happy to take questions. Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you so much, Karina, and what beautiful images as well. Thank you for sharing those. I'm sure that there will be many questions, but I think for now we'll keep them to the chat, and I'm going to introduce Melina and Jinsella, who are going to take us through a devil's advocate game. And if you have questions for Karina, do post them in the chat, and if we have time at the end, we'll come back to them. If not, we'll do our best to answer them in the chat. Thanks so much, Karina and Teray. Over to you, Jinsella and Melina.
Hello, everyone. So I'm just going to take the speech. I don't know. I speak French normally, so trying to figure it out. But I just wanted to kind of make a little comment about Karina's campaign and everything that has been going on in Australia. Last week, I moderated a Yorkshire CND event, which had a similar topic to this. And we had a speaker from New Mexico, whose name is Leona Morgan, and literally everything that you said, she basically said as well. And I think that if people still wonder how nuclear weapons are racist, they just don't get it. And it clearly has affected indigenous populations across the world for decades. And the arms trade as a whole has affected indigenous populations across the world for centuries. So yeah, that's just my little comment, but I'm gonna let Jinsella explain the rules of the game and stuff.
Yeah, Ray and Karina, thank you so much. There's so many amazing topics that have just fed into perhaps what people already know and perhaps completely new landscapes. So thank you for that. And to everyone watching, hi, hope you're having a great time. And yeah, I want you guys all to just think about, maybe there's something that's been said by Karina or Ray that has sat with you or made you feel a bit emotional. And I want you to feed that into what we're about to do, which is a game. So let's have a little bit of fun. Basically, it's a devil's advocate game. Just so you know, I listened intently to this talk, and I am just playing a role here, but I'm going to be the devil's advocate, actually, you know, saying that we should keep nuclear weapons, and I'm going to play the bad guy. And what I'm going to do is say statements, and in a second, Julie is going to share, oh, she's already shared it, a presentation in the chat. And if, I know Julie is going to share it as well, but if you on your screen can go to that presentation, then you'll see that each of the questions I'm going to ask is at the top, and there's lots of post-it notes. So when I say this statement, what you've got to do is comment on the post-it note and write your response. How would you argue? I'm sure all of us at some point have been so passionate and sure about something, and then we get to that family dinner table, or, you know, someone you've met, and suddenly you just feel like, oh my God, I don't know how to respond. So that's why we're doing this. It's so we can really bounce back the pros, the cons, like the ways to respond to difficult questions, which, you know, we can't, it takes time to fully understand. So yeah, Melina is going to read the comments that you're putting on the post-it notes and back them. And yeah, we will go from there. So the first one is, oh yeah, thank you. Can we go to that one? Nuclear weapons keep us safe because they discourage warfare between the states that create them and stabilize international relations. You know, it's true. Like the fact that we have nukes in the first place and we haven't had a nuclear war yet means that they're keeping us safe.
Yeah, I guess that's one way to say it, but it's good to see people are typing away. So that clearly means that, like, we've probably all at some point had to face this this question. How safe is a country without enough money to feed or educate everyone? Exactly. Like, what are nuclear weapons going to do when it comes to addressing a housing crisis or addressing a climate crisis? And, you know, just because some states have nuclear weapons, like, doesn't mean that doesn't encourage proliferation for other ones. Oh my gosh, everyone's
typing. But what are we going to do if one comes our way?
Well, I mean, technically, even the UK has that policy of, like, shoot first as a deterrent. So realistically, would you even have time to respond if one comes your way? Because, like, I mean, a bomb's a bomb. Like, who's going to be there to take care of it? Let's read some of these responses. How many thousands of people are under threat and experience of war? Proxy wars being fought by non-nuclear weapon states. Exactly. Technically speaking, we've had a lot more wars happen, like, in the last 30 years that have been heavily concentrated in certain areas of the globe and that have not kept us any safer and that have actually made situations even worse in these areas.
But what about North Korea? You don't know when they're going to send them our way, and I'd rather have them than not have them so we can retaliate at least. Well, we're never going to use them anyway.
Well, during the Cold War, the standoff between the USA and the USSR superpowers, they were often involved in warfare, and they did this through proxies in other states. So realistically, the chances of having, like, a nuke that's stamped love from North Korea is not likely. Cool. And then someone said, actually, they do not, because facts. Both Pakistan and India have come close to war. North Korea uses it to shake down the West, and also nuclear weapon systems have gone missing. That's frightening, actually. I did not even really know that one, so that's new. In 1950s, USA lost at least 4 free-fall nuke bombs. That's insane. Sorry, kind of panicking right now. Jesus. But yeah, essentially the idea that nuclear weapons do keep us safe is entirely wrong, because realistically, you're actually preparing yourself and you're preparing your economy and your structure to face irreparable and irreversible damage, potentially.
Oh, well, you're all very good at this, and, you know, like, I get where you're coming from, but as a global powerhouse like we are in the UK or the US or wherever, like, how are we going to remain our influence and keep our international relations stabilized if we don't have nukes along with the others?
Just because you've got weapons for deterrence doesn't mean that it's actually, yeah, I'm getting annoyed now, even though we actually work together. But just because you have nuclear weapons for deterrence doesn't mean that it won't actually like trigger other states to up their nuclear weapons. Like that's what the whole arms race is about, is the fact that no one's ever going to be armed enough and that everyone's always going to want to like one up each other. And it's just an infinite circle of like, we're not gonna make it. And someone said abolition, which I completely agree with.
So let's move on to the next one then, which is disarmament is only possible in democracies. Well, you heard me. Well, democracies could lose the bomb. Some authoritarian countries are bound to always keep their nuclear weapons. So what do we do about that, like other than have nuclear weapons?
Well, someone wrote that Russia, before the fall of Soviet Union, destroyed thousands of its stock, and also Libya, as a means of coming in from the Cold War, got rid of its own nukes. So technically speaking, you don't actually need nuclear weapons to be a democracy. Like the two do not go hand in hand. And having nuclear weapons or the most nuclear weapons doesn't make you the better democracy or like the best democracy.
But can we trust the undemocratic countries to disarm with us?
Well, again, the UK has a shoot first policy. How can we trust that they won't one day feel super threatened and go decide to press the button? If there's no consulting with the people in terms of like the use of that kind of weapon, which shouldn't even exist realistically speaking, like in this civilized post, savage age world or whatever, then why do we have these weapons that can be used without everyone's consent? That makes no sense. Is that truly a democracy, Jinsala? Not checking in with the people?
All right, next slide.
Gotcha. No, but this is a really good question that like, yeah, just because apparently someone has nuclear weapons, it makes them a better democracy. That is entirely not the case.
I wonder if has there ever been a referendum or anything on whether people actually want nuclear weapons? I don't know. Whether democratic or not, is it the right answer? But anyway, back to the bad guy. Lack of transparency equals danger. We could never know if a country has actually eliminated their nuclear weapons, so getting rid of ours puts us in a vulnerable position. This is what I was just saying, it's better to have a little bit of ammo, surely. And again, it just keeps us stay on top and stabilized to know that we're at least in line with other people or ahead of other people.
Well, the beauty about international law is that there are agencies and that there are agreements and that there are treaties that are in place so that when a country does decide to get rid of their nuclear weapons, there are safeguards that are put in place and accountability mechanisms to make sure that they don't actually step out of line and go overboard. One that the international body is the, let me make sure I say it right, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and they're the ones that oversee all of these safeguards and do all of the accountability kind of like maneuvers to make sure that those who have signed on are respecting the terms of the treaty. So if we can't trust in law and order, like where are we going, really?
Is it not like, kind of comparable to the drugs thing though? Like for example in Portugal, where they've legalized it and now they have greater control over who is doing it. There's less deaths because they can actually monitor how many people has nuclear weapons. If we say no nuclear weapons, then there's going to be a black market for it. I
am very curious as to like how you envision a nuclear weapons black market. Like it's not a little pocket bomb that you can just kind of like trade back and forth. And again, the point is that like, even so, for instance, even if we look at the arms trade, chemical weapons and like biological weapons have been banned. So why, and so they can't manufacture them anymore, technically speaking. But why can't that be the same case with nuclear weapons? That can definitely fall under the same umbrella of like atomic weapons. It's feasible. It's a possibility. If we get rid of our nuclear weapons, couldn't it also set an example to other countries? Exactly. Like, instead of falling in line, let's lead. Do you know what I mean? By example. Someone said it's factually
I've seen
incorrect.
someone comment ban nuclear power, but isn't nuclear power going to be one of the solutions of the environmental crisis? Plus, if people, if we have nuclear weapons, but if we ban nuclear weapons but can still have nuclear power, then that's where the black market will be.
The thing with civilian use of nuclear energy for like electricity and to kind of be that bridge with fossil fuels to sustainable energy, it all sounds wonderful, except when you remember that there is a lot of waste that is produced from even having nuclear energy. And thus, Leona from last week that I spoke about earlier, and I'm sure that even Karina could like give us some pointers on that, the waste still affects people negatively. And so there is no person, there is no way that you can create nuclear energy without having some sort of like massive harmful waste behind it. Like, sure, you're not actually blowing people up or like creating fallout and like creating this whole situation where you've got people that are going to be sick for years, but you're still actually putting people in danger and you're still making people sick for years. So until we can figure out our waste management system, that's not a solution.
Okay, well, amazing. I think we've come to our time, but it's so good to see all your comments. That was so hard for me. Gosh, I was like, ready to be the bad guy, and that was so hard. I was like, oh my gosh, don't say anything good. But honestly, it's been amazing to look at all your comments and like learning lots of different angles covered. I think you'll all be able to like save this presentation as well. So, please do and use this resource, and
for sure,
hopefully it's been helpful. Please drop in the comments if it has been helpful to hear some things be bounced back and forth like that. And yeah, thank you for having us. Melina and I run a non-profit called Demilitarised Education, aka Deducation, and we're trying to get universities to demilitarize. So yeah, thanks for having us, and back to you, Julie.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jinsella and Melina, for that utterly hilarious game. I will definitely be logging some of these arguments in my mind for Christmas dinner. I just wanted to maybe return, because we've had a really important question, I think, from Linda for Karina. Karina, I see that you have posted a response in the chat, but I was wondering if you could just voice that, because I think it's really important to talk about reparations and moving forwards.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I from a personal and from, I suppose, my people as well, there's been no official apology by the British government of what they did in testing on our traditional lands in emu fields and Yarrowdale. So some acknowledgement of the harm that they've done, or acknowledgement of what they did back in the 50s and 60s here in Australia. And then, of course, I would, encourage that they signed the treaty, and that's one of the issues that we've got here in Australia, is that Australia hasn't signed our treaty, and that's, I hear through networks that because the world is so unstable, politically unstable at the moment, people are not ready to sort of lead by example, as Melina was saying. There are countries sort of standing back and watching what other countries are doing. I think we should take a lesson from New Zealand and, really stand ourselves as a nation, as a country, Australia, to stand independently and away from the US as well, because, often we are sort of dragged into some of their struggles as well. And so it's a really unstable political scene globally at the moment. And I think we've got to start by leading by example. And I feel Australia should certainly think and consider. And I'm sure that's the thinking from ICANN as well, and the thinking of many of us who are part of ICANN to really get our stories and remind Australia of the history that we have here. It's interesting to know that not very many South Australians, let alone Australians, are really aware of what happened in the 50s and 60s. And it's a story that Australia, I think, is quite comfortable with just sweeping it under the carpet. And there is a little bit of political pushback in relation to the waste dump as well that we are starting to see signs of. And I think we've got an ongoing issue here in Australia in relation to the waste dump. The concerns from my people is that if we open the door, the floods will happen, and that was part of the work that we had done when our state government here in South Australia, a Labor government, who, you know, at some point were seen to be, you know, a government we could rely on here in Australia and in South Australia to stand with us in, you know, our state legislation as well, which was done by a former Labor government. Decided to run a royal commission into the fuel cycle, and the hidden agenda, of course, was looking into cashing in on the waste and international waste as well. And it was really important for Aboriginal people to be involved in that whole royal commission as well. So, you know, it's an ongoing struggle for us, and Aboriginal people are constantly bombarded by governments of the day, you know, coming up with some crazy solution of sticking waste into traditional lands in, you know, in outback South Australia. And, you know, many of us have grave concerns and have to continue to, you know, remind everybody about what happened in the 50s and 60s and those stories of those amazing old women, along with my late father and many other survivors of those British nuclear tests, still have to continue to remind Australia of what happened back then, to keep that story alive and ongoing, and also for the wider community to understand why we object and why we stand against this, that the solution is not to come and stick it in the ground of, you know, what government might see to be, you know, remote and isolated. And so it's an ongoing struggle that we have here in Australia, where they mine. We have no power here in Australia, but they want to come and bring that waste into our country and into our state of South Australia. So this is an ongoing battle, and it'll be a fight and a battle for my children as well as the next generation.
Thank you so much, Karina. I just wanted to say that it's 8 o'clock, which is the time that we said we'd finish this event, but I feel that we're having such great quality discussions. I would plead with you to stay with us for an extra 10 minutes longer, if you would be happy to, so that we could take another question, especially given that we've woken Karina up at 6 a.m. in order to come and speak to us. So we will try and end by, at the very latest, 1:15, if you can hold off from going to bed till 8:30 rather than 8:15. Joe, I know that you have a question.
Yeah, hey, thank you so much to Ray, Karina, Ginsella and Melina for everything that you've said tonight. I've already learned so much from this, and I also saw in the chat that people are asking about how they can share these lessons more broadly, and I think Bob was saying that the game in itself was such a cool educational tool. I just wanted to flag quickly that CND recently, in the past 2 years, has produced a teaching pack called Critical Maths. It's called, its subtitle is Lessons on Gender, Race and Nuclear Weapons. And it was inspired directly from Ray's writing. It also features a link to Karina's testimony that was given at the UN and was integral to getting the TPNW pushed through. So totally indebted to you guys. And I just wondered, Karina, you're talking about this kind of intergenerational struggle that you kind of have to constantly repeat in order to make high level white male people feel empathy for a place and actions that seem really distant to them. But then despite that, you spreading this message and repeating these lessons that people must learn is what's kind of got a global ban accepted and in momentum. So I just wondered whether you could kind of talk about how your experience has been educating people through personal and intergenerational testimony, because it sounds powerful but tiring and painful at the same time.
Thank you for your question, and it is a tough one because it is something that I often fight with as well. But I feel my lessons learned from my older generation, and in particular, this amazing cultural knowledge and a cultural responsibility that they came from. Many of those amazing old women were very strong culturally and very aware of their Anangu role and responsibility. And they had great knowledge. They had knowledge of country. They had knowledge of their stories that zigzagged and crisscrossed our nation. And many of those old women really spoke strongly against that was their cultural responsibility to look after, because of the great traditional cultural knowledge that they have and held and passed on to the next generation. And I'm still very lucky to be able to have my cultural connect to my people. And that is because I still speak my native language. I still participate in cultural events and cultural activities. I still go back to my traditional lands on a regular basis and take my children. And I think that strength from the very ground that I live on and the people that I'm a part of is where I draw a lot of my strength to really stand up strong, because those old women certainly did. Cultural responsibility, and my late father as well, who was very powerful in uniting us as Yankunytjatjara, as his own people, but to really go up against this huge complex world out there. And I learn from those lessons, and I look at those leaders, and I have this feeling of responsibility as well, as part of the kin, but also a mother myself as well. And I feel having that balance is really powerful. And I learned a lesson from my grandmothers that they weren't only just worried about Yankunytjatjara, but they were also concerned about the wider community. So it wasn't just a Black issue, it was everybody's issue. And that was a big lesson for me as well, that I didn't have to go and fight so hard for my mob, but that was important. But I had to go in there and fight for everybody. And, that through the whole journey, yes, I had to talk about my stories, personal stories, and my people's stories. But I gained so much in being able to go there and do what I do, but also hear from amazing people, and hear from Habakasha and build this network, and really remove my blinkers to look at how this is such a global issue and how important it is for us to continue to share those stories. And I think I just get that grounding from my connect to country. I can kind of escape and go back to what's the basic and simple things in life, and appreciate it, and smell the fresh air, and hear my country, practice and participate in my culture as well, which strengthens me to then go up against a very Western political complex system. And I'm very privileged that I can do that still today in 2020.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Karina. We're going to close with a poem. Hannah Smith is going to read us a poem by Marshall Islands activist Kathy Jetnil-Kiunga. It tells the story of her friend Bianca. Just to introduce Hannah is a student and CND supporter, and Hannah was instrumental in helping us to organise the Devil's Advocate game that we just played, and she came up with the comments that we addressed. Hannah, over to you.
Hi, thanks. So yeah, I'm going to read a poem by a poet from the Marshall Islands about the children who still experience cancer as a result of nuclear tests. Sorry, my Wi-Fi is a little bit dodgy, but I hope you can hear me okay. Okay, so the poem is called Bursts of Bianca. When you come through the door, she is a burst of small sunny afternoons, giggle, glitter, and deep, deep eyes, deep, deep dimples that radiate from her starchy, crinkled gown. She is 10. You see the feeding tube snaking into her nose, the ivy that breaks into the skin of her wrist, the twist of her fists in her sheets. But don't feel too much, just listen, because she's trying to tell you a story about the day she was sent to the principal's office for yelling at a boy who was copying her answers, a dumb boy who obviously liked her. The nurse breezes in, and you are startled, but she keeps going. She never complains about the chemotherapy, she just keeps going. This is not uncommon, you remind yourself. This situation, not so rare. Most Marshallese can say they've mastered the language of cancer. Bianca doesn't know much English, and yet she knows what blood cells means, what bone marrow, catheter, and remission therapy means. You think about this as you stare at Bianca, rainbows of beads budding across blanket. But today, you and Bianca will not be discussing the effects of nuclear testing, or colonization, or the cancers that shadow your people. Instead, you will discuss the contours of SpongeBob. You will construct paper card castles, craft the best pudding and ketchup stew, kaleidoscope colours across her nails. Use her blanket for a sail. You won't talk about her aches, her untouched plate, the sun rays she can no longer seek, the funeral that chokes your dreams. And when visiting hours are over, it's not easy. It's harder than you think. The nuzzled kiss, the frumpled tight hug, the cross your heart think you promise you'll be back. Yes, you promise and promise her. You will be back, and as you leave, the door clicks shut behind you, and suddenly it is harder to breathe. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hanifa. That was extremely moving. I would like to conclude tonight's event just by maybe offering a round of applause to Karina, Ray, Melina, Jinsella, and Hanifa, and also to Julie, the coordinator for London Region CND, who's done a fantastic job at organising tonight's event. So thank you so much to all of our speakers and collaborators who made this event possible tonight. We have a full programme at CND of other events, so we'd love to invite you to the London Region CND conference, which is taking place in January and will be this year on China and US nuclear policy. There's also an event organised by National CND in January about the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, if you'd like to find out more. And on the 28th of January, Youth and Student CND are holding an event called Wellbeing for Future Generations in collaboration with The Big Issue. Please do follow us on social media. You can find us at London Region CND and Youth and Student CND on Twitter, Instagram, and other places. Find us on Facebook as well. Please do give us some feedback about this event if you enjoyed it or if you didn't enjoy it, because we learn from feedback. So Julie has put up a poll right now. And again, thank you so much for joining us today and being part of this important conversation. And thank you to our speakers again. We wish you a good evening.